Officer Jake Morgan had been patrolling the streets of Midtown for over a decade. To the people who knew him, he was a paradox. Some admired his deep understanding of the city's rhythm, his instinct for spotting trouble before it erupted. Others found his blunt, no-nonsense demeanor grating, bordering on abrasive. Jake's uniform was always crisp, his badge gleaming, but his attitude was weathered by years of dealing with the city's worst, and occasionally, its entitled elite. That morning, Jake had rolled out of bed with the same familiar groan. His one-bedroom apartment was sparsely furnished, a testament to his utilitarian outlook on life. The coffee maker sputtered to life as he flipped through the morning news on his tablet. Murders, robberies, political scandals, the usual. Nothing seemed to surprise him anymore. He'd long stopped hoping for uplifting stories. The world didn't work that way, at least not in Jake Morgan's Midtown. Sliding into his patrol car, Jake adjusted his rearview mirror and glanced at his reflection. His once dark hair was now peppered with streaks of gray, a badge of honor he wore with pride. The streets were busy, as always, teeming with cars, pedestrians, and the occasional street performer trying to eke out a living. Jake knew these streets like the back of his hand. He could tell you which alleyways were safe, which buildings had security cameras, and which corners were favored by pickpockets. The morning began uneventfully. He issued a ticket to a delivery truck illegally parked in a bike lane, grumbled at a jaywalking pedestrian who ignored the blaring walk signal, and checked in on a store owner who'd recently been robbed. Routine stuff. But as the hours dragged on, the irritations of city life began to pile up. By noon, Jake's mood had soured. He was stuck directing traffic at a clogged intersection after an impatient driver caused a minor fender bender. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the heat seemed to amplify every horn honk and every muttered complaint from the passers-by. When the intersection finally cleared, Jake returned to his car, muttering under his breath about the state of humanity. "Why can't people just follow the rules?" he grumbled, slamming the door shut. His partner for the day, Officer Ramirez, chuckled softly. "Maybe because they're human, Jake," Ramirez said. "You're not exactly the poster boy for patience yourself." "Patience is for people who don't live here," Jake shot back. "You want patience, move to the suburbs." Ramirez shrugged and returned to scrolling through his phone. Jake couldn't blame him. They'd had a long week, and the job wasn't getting easier. Midtown's precinct was one of the busiest in the city, and the constant calls took their toll. It wasn't just the criminals or the emergencies, it was the grind. The endless sea of people, each with their own problems, each needing something from the badge Jake wore. As Jake cruised down 8th Avenue, he spotted a sleek black sedan idling at a red light. The car was polished to perfection, its tinted windows gleaming under the sun. He frowned. Something about fancy cars always rubbed him the wrong way. Too many times, he'd seen them speed through school zones or park where they weren't supposed to, as if their owners believed their wealth exempted them from the rules. "Check this out," Jake said, nodding toward the sedan. "Bet you $5 they're up to something." Ramirez looked up and rolled his eyes. "Come on, Jake. It's just a car. Let it go." But Jake wasn't listening. His eyes narrowed as he noticed the driver holding a phone. Sure, the light was red, but the city had strict hands-free laws, and Jake wasn't in the mood to let anyone slide today. Flipping on his lights, he pulled up behind the car and hit the siren. The sedan rolled to the curb with the smooth precision of someone who wasn't particularly worried. Jake's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He couldn't explain it, but the car, and whoever was driving it, annoyed him. "Let's see what their excuse is," he muttered, grabbing his ticket pad and stepping out of the car. Ramirez stayed behind, shaking his head but knowing better than to intervene. This was Jake's show now. As Jake approached the driver's side window, he mentally prepared himself for the usual excuses. But when the window rolled down and he saw the driver, a young woman with sharp features, sunglasses perched on her nose, his annoyance flared even further. Something about her calm, almost indifferent demeanor irritated him. He wasn't sure why yet, but he intended to find out. The driver of the sleek black sedan was nothing like Jake had expected. Her sharp features were framed by dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail, and the sunglasses on her face only added to the air of composure she exuded. She didn't seem flustered or nervous, which was unusual. Most people, when pulled over, were quick to apologize or at least looked uncomfortable. But this woman simply turned her head toward Jake as he approached, her expression unreadable. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice smooth and even, as though she were greeting an acquaintance rather than someone about to issue her a ticket. Jake's irritation deepened. "Afternoon. Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his tone clipped. She tilted her head slightly. "I assume it's because you think I was using my phone." "But I wasn't," she replied. Her voice wasn't defensive, just matter of fact. Jake raised an eyebrow. "I saw you holding it." "Yes, at a red light," she said. "I wasn't driving." "The law doesn't make that distinction," Jake shot back. "Phone use is phone use. License and registration, please." The woman sighed softly but didn't argue further. She opened her glove compartment and retrieved the requested documents, handing them over without a word. Jake's eyes scanned the license. Rachel Carter. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. Her address indicated she was new to the city, which explained the out-of-state plates on her car. "New in town, huh?" he said, his tone still curt. "Let me give you some advice. Around here, we take the law seriously. You might want to keep that in mind." She didn't flinch under his scrutiny. In fact, she almost smiled. "I'll keep that in mind, Officer Morgan," she said, her tone polite but firm. Jake's eyebrows furrowed. "How do you know my name?" he asked sharply. She gestured subtly toward his chest. "Your badge," she said simply. There was no smugness in her voice, just a calm observation. For a moment, Jake felt a flicker of embarrassment, but he quickly masked it with his usual gruffness. He handed back her documents. "You're free to go," he said, stepping back. "Just watch yourself next time." Rachel nodded once, her expression unchanging. "Thank you, officer. Have a good day." With that, she rolled up her window and smoothly merged back into traffic. As Jake watched her car disappear down the street, he couldn't shake the feeling that he just missed something important. He climbed back into his patrol car, still frowning. "So, what's the verdict?" Ramirez asked, glancing up from his phone. Jake didn't answer right away. "Just someone new who thinks they're smarter than they are," he muttered, though deep down, he wasn't so sure. There was something about Rachel Carter that lingered in his mind, and it wasn't just the irritation of the encounter. But for now, he dismissed it and drove off, ready to tackle the next annoyance of the day. Jake's day had barely settled after his encounter with Rachel Carter when another call came through. Dispatch had reported an escalating situation near one of the city's busiest intersections. With traffic already a mess and tempers flaring across Midtown, Jake and Ramirez were tasked with managing what was described as an aggressive dispute between two drivers following a minor collision. As they arrived at the scene, the noise hit them first. Raised voices pierced the humid air, drawing the attention of pedestrians who had gathered to watch the spectacle unfold. Jake stepped out of the patrol car, his shoulders squared as he surveyed the scene. One man, red-faced and gesticulating wildly, was shouting at a younger driver, whose car's bumper was now hanging precariously off one side. The younger man, though visibly shaken, was attempting to defend himself while simultaneously making futile efforts to reach his insurance company on his phone. Jake strode up to the scene, his voice cutting through the noise. "All right, enough. Everyone, calm down." The red-faced man turned his ire toward Jake. "Calm down? This punk just ruined my car. Do you know how much that bumper's going to cost to fix?" Jake's eyes flicked to the vehicles. The damage was minor at best, a dent here, a scratch there. Hardly worth the theatrics. "Sir, step back and let's handle this like adults," Jake said firmly. "We'll get a report filed and let insurance take care of the rest." The man opened his mouth to argue, but Jake's sharp glare silenced him. Turning to the younger driver, Jake softened his tone. "You all right, kid?" The young man nodded hesitantly. "Yeah, I'm fine. He's really mad." "We'll sort it out," Jake assured him before motioning for Ramirez to start taking notes and photos of the scene. Jake's attention was split between calming the irate man and guiding the young driver to provide his insurance information. Though he had dealt with countless similar incidents, there was something about this situation that felt different, a palpable tension in the air that seemed ready to boil over. "All right," Jake said, standing between the two men as Ramirez diligently documented the scene. "Let's get the paperwork done. Both of you will need to contact your insurance providers. We'll file a report, and you'll," the older man interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. "File a report? That's all you're going to do? He should be paying for this mess out of pocket." Jake's patience, already frayed from the morning's events, wore even thinner. He took a deep breath and fixed the man with a steely glare. "Sir, this isn't negotiable. The process is clear. Now either cooperate, or I'll have to escalate this." "You're kidding me," the man scoffed. "Escalate? You cops are all the same. Useless when it actually matters." Ramirez shifted uncomfortably, but Jake remained composed, his jaw tightening. He had heard similar remarks before, but they still struck a nerve. "We're here to ensure this doesn't get out of hand," Jake said evenly. "If you want to press charges or claim additional damages, you can take it to civil court." The younger driver, visibly intimidated by the heated exchange, finally found his voice. "Look, I didn't mean to hit his car. It was just a small mistake. I'll do whatever I need to fix it." "Small mistake," the older man snapped, his face reddening further. "That small mistake could have caused an accident. What if there were kids nearby?" Jake stepped in again, raising his hands to signal for calm. "That's enough. Both of you, step back and let us do our job." The man's eyes burned with frustration, but he backed off, muttering under his breath about inept cops and reckless drivers. Jake exchanged a glance with Ramirez, who gave a subtle nod, signaling that the photos and initial details had been logged. As Jake turned to retrieve the incident report sheet, he noticed a familiar black sedan approaching the scene. The vehicle slowed and pulled over to the curb. For a brief moment, Jake's pulse quickened. It was Rachel Carter. She stepped out of the car with the same composed demeanor she had exhibited earlier, her sunglasses still in place. This time, however, she carried an air of quiet authority that caught even Jake off guard. As she approached, her gaze swept over the scene, taking in the vehicles, the irate man, and Jake himself. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone calm but commanding. Before Jake could respond, the older man turned to her, gesturing wildly at the damaged vehicles. "What's going on is that this idiot hit my car, and these officers aren't doing anything about it." Rachel raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his theatrics. "I see. And have you provided your insurance information to the officers yet?" The man blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Well, no, but then I suggest you do so now," Rachel said firmly. "Arguing isn't going to resolve anything." Jake watched the exchange with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Who was this woman to walk onto the scene and take control? And why did she seem so comfortable doing it? The man grumbled but eventually handed over his insurance details to Ramirez, who gave Rachel a questioning look. She nodded slightly, acknowledging his silent inquiry. Turning back to Jake, Rachel removed her sunglasses, revealing sharp eyes that held his gaze steadily. "Looks like you've got things under control here, Officer Morgan. Keep up the good work." There was something about the way she said his name that sent a ripple of unease through him. It wasn't just the words, it was the knowing tone behind them, as if she understood something about him that he didn't yet comprehend. Before he could respond, Rachel returned to her car, her every movement deliberate and self-assured. As she drove off, Jake stood rooted to the spot, a nagging sense of familiarity tugging at the edges of his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter, like their earlier one, was more significant than it appeared. Ramirez approached, clipboard in hand. "Everything's wrapped up here," he said. "But who was that?" Jake shook his head slowly, still staring down the street where Rachel's car had disappeared. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I have a feeling we're going to find out." The Midtown precinct was as chaotic as ever when Jake and Ramirez returned to file their report. Phones rang incessantly, officers shuffled between desks with files tucked under their arms, and the faint hum of chatter filled the air. The familiar energy was comforting in a strange way, predictable and routine. Jake preferred it that way. The constant stream of tasks helped him push aside the unsettling encounters from earlier. Jake dropped into his worn swivel chair and pulled the report from his clipboard. His desk was a cluttered amalgamation of paperwork, coffee mugs, and a small framed photo of his niece, the only family member he kept in touch with regularly. Ramirez leaned against the edge of the desk, typing notes into his tablet. "You've been quiet since we left the scene," Ramirez remarked, glancing at Jake. Jake grunted noncommittally, flipping through the report. "Just a lot on my mind," he said, though it was clear Ramirez wasn't buying it. "Is it about the woman from earlier? The one with the car?" Jake hesitated, then sighed. "Yeah. Rachel Carter. There's something about her. She knew how to handle the guy at the scene like she's done it 1,000 times before. And she said my name like she knew me." Ramirez chuckled. "Maybe she's just one of those people. You know, confident, used to being in control." "Maybe," Jake muttered, though the explanation felt too simple. The door to the precinct opened, and a hush swept through the room. Jake looked up from his report, and his jaw tightened as Rachel Carter stepped inside, flanked by 2 senior officers. She was no longer dressed in civilian attire, but in a crisp, tailored police uniform. The badge on her chest gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the gold insignia on her collar marked her rank unmistakably, police chief. "Attention," one of the senior officers barked, and the room snapped to order. Officers stood at their desks, and conversations ceased as Rachel strode confidently to the front of the room. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice carrying effortlessly over the quiet room. "As many of you may already know, I'm Chief Rachel Carter, your new commanding officer. I look forward to working with all of you to make Midtown safer and more efficient." Jake's stomach dropped. He exchanged a glance with Ramirez, who looked equally stunned. The woman he had ticketed earlier, the same one who had so effortlessly taken control of the traffic dispute, was now his superior. Rachel continued, outlining her plans for the precinct. She spoke about improving response times, implementing new training protocols, and fostering better relationships with the community. Her words were confident and precise, leaving little room for doubt about her capability. As she spoke, Jake's mind raced. How could he have been so blind? Her calm demeanor, the way she carried herself, it all made sense now. And then there was the way she'd handled him during their initial encounter. Had she been testing him? When Rachel finished her address, she smiled warmly at the room. "I'm excited to get to know each of you and hear your thoughts on how we can improve. My door is always open." As the officers began to settle back into their routines, Rachel approached Jake's desk with the same air of quiet confidence that now felt all too familiar. "Officer Morgan," she said, her tone professional but with a hint of amusement. Jake stood quickly, feeling the weight of the moment. "Chief Carter," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Rachel studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "We seem to have gotten off on the wrong foot this morning," she said, extending her hand. Jake hesitated briefly before shaking it. "I didn't realize who you were," he admitted. "I know," she said, her lips curving into a small smile. "And I didn't expect you to. But now that you do, I hope we can start fresh." Jake nodded, though he couldn't help feeling like he was being sized up. "Of course, Chief." Rachel's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she turned to Ramirez. "Officer Ramirez, it's good to meet you as well. I'll be sitting in on some patrols over the next few weeks, so don't be surprised if I join one of your shifts." Ramirez gave a nervous laugh. "Looking forward to it, Chief." As Rachel walked away, Jake sank back into his chair, exhaling slowly. Ramirez leaned in, lowering his voice. "Well, this just got interesting." Jake shot him a look. That's one way to put it. For the rest of the day, Jake found it hard to focus. Rachel Carter's presence loomed large in his mind, not just as his new boss, but as someone who had already managed to throw him off balance. If she was here to shake things up, Jake had a feeling he'd be at the center of it all. Jake Morgan wasn't the kind of man who adapted easily to change. Over the years, he had crafted a specific rhythm to his work, one honed through experience and a stubborn reliance on his instincts. So, when Rachel Carter took charge of the Midtown precinct, it wasn't just a disruption to his routine, it felt like a challenge to his very identity. The day after Rachel's arrival, Jake found himself in the precinct's bustling locker room, the familiar clang of metal doors and murmurs of conversation filling the air. Ramirez, already in uniform, stood beside him, watching with amusement as Jake muttered under his breath. "You're still stewing about yesterday, aren't you?" Ramirez asked, leaning against a row of lockers. Jake shot him a look, tugging his patrol vest into place. "I'm not stewing. I just don't like surprises." "Surprises like finding out the woman you ticketed is now your boss?" Ramirez grinned. Jake ignored him, focusing instead on adjusting his radio. The truth was, Ramirez wasn't entirely wrong. The revelation of Rachel's position had shaken him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the embarrassment of their earlier encounter, it was the realization that she represented everything he wasn't. Where Jake was rough around the edges, Rachel was polished and professional. Where he relied on instinct, she seemed to operate with calculated precision. As Jake and Ramirez headed out on patrol, the tension lingered. The streets of Midtown were their usual chaotic selves, with honking horns, jaywalkers, and the occasional street vendor arguing over turf. But Jake's mind wasn't on the job. "What do you think of her?" Jake asked suddenly as they cruised down 10th Avenue. "Chief Carter?" Ramirez glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "She seems sharp. Knows her stuff." "Why, you worried?" "Worried? No," Jake said quickly, though the edge in his voice betrayed him. "I just don't see the point of someone like her being here. Midtown's not the kind of place where you can run things by the book." Ramirez chuckled. "Maybe that's why she's here, to prove you wrong." Jake didn't respond, but the thought gnawed at him. Midtown was messy, unpredictable. It wasn't the kind of environment that lent itself to rigid rules and formalities. Yet Rachel had walked into the precinct with the confidence of someone who believed she could change that. Their patrol continued uneventfully until they received a call about a disturbance at a local diner. Arriving at the scene, Jake felt a flicker of relief. A familiar situation, a chance to regain his footing. Inside, two men were arguing loudly, their voices rising above the clatter of dishes and murmurs of customers. "Break it up," Jake commanded as he stepped between them. His presence alone was usually enough to diffuse such situations, but one of the men, a wiry, middle-aged guy with a scruffy beard, wasn't backing down. "He owes me money," the man shouted, pointing at the other. Jake raised a hand. "I don't care who owes who. You're both causing a scene, and it stops now." The argument subsided, though the tension remained palpable. Jake guided the men outside, where Ramirez began taking their statements. It was a textbook resolution, no escalation, no unnecessary drama. Yet as they drove back to the precinct, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Later that afternoon, Jake found himself in Rachel's office for the first time. The space was clean and orderly, a stark contrast to his cluttered desk. Rachel sat behind a polished wooden desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "Officer Morgan," she began, gesturing for him to sit. "How's the adjustment going?" Jake hesitated before sitting down, his posture stiff. "Fine," he said curtly. Rachel tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You don't seem convinced." Jake exhaled sharply. "With all due respect, Chief, I've been doing this job a long time. I know how Midtown works. And it's not always by the book. Rachel nodded, her expression thoughtful. I respect your experience, Officer Morgan. That's why I'm here, to learn from it while introducing some of my own strategies. The city's changing, and we need to adapt with it. Jake frowned. Adapting doesn't mean throwing out what already works. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. Agreed. But it also doesn't mean resisting every new idea. I'm not here to undermine you, Officer Morgan. I'm here to make us all better. For a moment, the room was silent. Jake wanted to argue, to push back against what felt like a challenge to his authority. But something in Rachel's tone stopped him. It wasn't condescending or dismissive, it was genuine. I'll keep that in mind, Jake said finally, though his tone was far from enthusiastic. As he left her office, Jake felt a mix of frustration and grudging respect. Rachel Carter wasn't just another bureaucrat passing through the precinct. She was a force to be reckoned with, and Jake wasn't sure how to feel about that. The precinct was buzzing with activity as usual, but today there was an undercurrent of tension, an energy that felt different from the ordinary hum of police work. Officers milled about, going through paperwork, chatting with colleagues, and answering phone calls. But behind the casual chatter, the rumor mill was working overtime. Word had quickly spread that there was a new precinct commander, someone high-ranking, someone who would likely change the dynamics of the place. No one seemed to know much about her, but the mere whisper of a new commander had everyone speculating. Jake Morgan, as usual, was sitting at his desk, his feet propped up on the edge while he scrolled through his phone. He'd already been briefed on the rumors, but wasn't particularly interested in them. To him, the idea of a new commander was just another blip on the radar, something that would come and go without much consequence. He had been working the streets for over a decade and had seen his fair share of leadership changes. Most of them were nothing more than bureaucratic shifts, temporary faces that came and went. He was used to it. But today, something was different. The precinct had a strange feeling to it, like everyone was bracing for something. Maybe it was because the change was happening so suddenly. Or maybe it was just that no one knew what to expect. Everyone had heard the rumors about the new commander's credentials. Some said she was a hard-nosed, no-nonsense type, others said she was an up-and-comer with a reputation for getting things done. But no one seemed to know much beyond that. The silence about her background only made the anticipation stronger. Jake wasn't concerned, though. He had his usual chip on his shoulder, one that was often displayed with a scoff or a sarcastic comment to anyone who tried to engage in the office gossip. He was just another cog in the machine, and as far as he was concerned, nothing would change because of some new face at the top. He didn't care about titles or ranks. He just wanted to do his job and get through his day. But when the doors to the precinct suddenly swung open, and the sound of heels clicking sharply on the floor filled the air, Jake's relaxed posture shifted. A chill ran through him that he couldn't quite explain. It was as if the room had collectively held its breath. The officers who had been talking in hushed tones quickly went silent, and all eyes turned toward the woman entering the room. Jake glanced up from his desk, his eyes narrowing as he saw the newcomer step into the precinct with an air of undeniable authority. She was tall, with striking features, dark hair pulled back into a neat, professional bun. She wore a crisp, tailored uniform that only emphasized her commanding presence. But what truly struck him, even more than her physical appearance, was the aura of confidence she exuded. She didn't walk into the room, she commanded it. Jake's stomach tightened as he took in the details. Something about her seemed familiar. The woman's steely eyes swept across the room, and when they landed on Jake, they didn't waver. It took him a moment to place her, the smooth, calm voice, the elegance, the poise, and then it hit him like a slap in the face. She was the same woman he had stopped just 2 days ago. The same woman he had accused of being entitled and rude during that traffic stop. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what to do with the realization. The woman who had calmly corrected him, the woman who had remained unfazed by his insults, was now standing in front of him, not as a civilian, but as his superior. His embarrassment was palpable, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt small. Captain Rachel Carter. The officers around him were still in a state of stunned silence, clearly processing the revelation. Jake, for a moment, was paralyzed, but as she moved further into the precinct, his feet finally moved too. He stood up, a little too quickly, trying to appear unaffected by the tension in the air. But the awkwardness of the moment was undeniable. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, and despite himself, he felt a flush creeping up his neck. Captain Carter stopped in the middle of the room and turned to face them all. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm Captain Rachel Carter, and I'll be overseeing this precinct moving forward." Jake's stomach churned, but he kept his expression neutral, as he had done for years. He wasn't about to let anyone see the discomfort in his eyes. But as she continued speaking, he couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled over him. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, and he knew she remembered him. She remembered the way he had treated her. The way he had assumed her worth based on her car. The way he had belittled her without a second thought. And now, here she was, standing before him as his commanding officer. As Captain Carter introduced herself to the rest of the precinct, the reality of the situation settled in for Jake. He had been a fool. He had underestimated her, thinking that his position and years of experience made him untouchable. But now, he was the one who felt exposed, and he wasn't sure how to navigate the awkwardness of this new dynamic. Captain Carter finished her introduction, and the room remained silent for a moment. Jake could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he braced for whatever would come next. Would she call him out? Would she make a public example of him? He didn't know what to expect, but for the first time in a long while, Jake felt uncertain. What he didn't expect, however, was the way Captain Carter handled it. She said nothing about their prior encounter. She didn't berate him in front of his colleagues, nor did she make any overt reference to their exchange. Instead, she simply moved on, continuing to speak with professionalism, showing respect to the officers in the room. For Jake, the lack of confrontation was almost worse than if she had publicly reprimanded him. It made him feel like a child who had been caught doing something wrong but wasn't immediately punished. The silent acknowledgement that she had the power to do so was all the more humiliating. As she finished speaking, Captain Carter's eyes briefly flicked back to Jake one more time. Her gaze was calm, composed, and yet, there was an unmistakable sharpness in it. He had no doubt she remembered everything about their interaction, about the way he had treated her. And now, he was left with the uneasy realization that he had made a grave mistake. In that moment, Jake knew this wasn't just another leadership change. This was a turning point. One that he hadn't seen coming. The room was still, almost unnervingly quiet, as Captain Rachel Carter stood at the front of the precinct, her presence commanding every ounce of attention. She was poised and collected, the very picture of authority, yet there was an undeniable calmness about her that made the entire room listen intently. Even though she had just walked in, it felt as if she had been there for years, like she belonged in that space, a natural leader. Jake stood at the back, his posture tense, his mind racing. He tried to focus on her words, but the fact that she was the same woman he had humiliated just days ago weighed heavily on his thoughts. The discomfort gnawed at him, but he couldn't look away. He had to hear her out. "Good morning, everyone," Captain Carter began, her voice steady, clear, and commanding. It was the kind of voice that made you sit up straight, regardless of your rank. "I'm Captain Rachel Carter, and I'll be overseeing this precinct from now on." The weight of her words settled over the room like a fog. She wasn't just introducing herself, she was laying down a marker, signaling that things would be different from here on out. Her gaze swept across the officers present, making brief but meaningful eye contact with each one. When her eyes briefly met Jake's, he felt a sharp, almost invisible pressure, something that made his stomach tighten. She continued, "Respect for the badge is not just about wearing the uniform, it's about the way we carry ourselves, how we treat others, and how we lead by example." Her tone was firm, but there was no arrogance in it. It wasn't a lecture, it was a reminder, one that resonated with everyone in the room. Jake felt a deep sense of discomfort as he stood there, silently absorbing her words. She wasn't just giving a speech, she was setting the tone for what she expected from each and every officer, including him. The words didn't just apply to the rookies or the officers with less experience. They applied to him, too. The weight of her leadership and the silent acknowledgement of their previous encounter hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time, Jake realized that he had misjudged someone he never should have underestimated. Captain Carter's introduction ended without fanfare. She wasn't here to make grand gestures, she was here to do the job, and she expected nothing less from those around her. As Captain Carter concluded her introduction, the room remained silent, still processing the magnitude of the moment. Everyone knew the arrival of a new commander was significant, but for Jake, it held a much more personal weight. His pulse quickened, and his breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him fully. This was the woman he had treated with such disdain just days ago, the woman he had judged based solely on her car and assumed entitlement. He stood frozen, his mind racing. How had he not recognized her sooner? How could he have been so blind? It felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted, and he was now standing on unstable footing, facing the consequences of his earlier actions. He had made a rash, arrogant assumption during their brief encounter, and now here she was, not just as a fellow officer, but as his commanding officer, someone whose authority he could no longer ignore. Jake tried to maintain his composure, but he could feel the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. His colleagues, some of whom had been eyeing him all morning, now seemed to notice his discomfort. They exchanged glances, their expressions curious but carefully neutral. They had all seen Jake at his most confident, often dismissive of authority and eager to push boundaries. But today, in front of this new captain, his usual bravado felt hollow. He wasn't the same Jake Morgan now. The weight of her unspoken judgment seemed to press down on him with every passing second. Captain Carter didn't acknowledge their previous encounter. She didn't point him out or make a public spectacle of the situation. Her professionalism was a silent rebuke that made Jake feel even more exposed. It was as if she was giving him the space to process his mistake, allowing him to come to terms with his actions without adding any fuel to the fire. The fact that she didn't directly address him made her presence even more intimidating. She was in control, and Jake was left to wrestle with his own sense of shame. Despite the tension he felt, Jake couldn't help but respect her. She was calm, composed, and above all, she was in charge. He had made a serious misstep, and now, he had to live with the knowledge that someone he had underestimated not only outranked him but had done so with grace and poise. The feeling of embarrassment settled deep within him, but it also ignited something else, an understanding that things had changed. And it was time for him to change too. From that moment onward, Jake Morgan knew things would never be the same. The reality of the situation settled deep within him. He had misjudged someone who now held authority over him. Captain Rachel Carter's presence was a constant reminder that leadership wasn't just about rank, it was about respect, responsibility, and integrity. Her calm demeanor, coupled with her quiet but undeniable strength, made Jake realize that he had made a mistake, not just in how he treated her, but in how he viewed his own role in the precinct. In the days that followed, Jake became more mindful of his actions. He began to approach his work with a renewed sense of respect, not only for Captain Carter but for the badge he wore. The arrogance that once defined him was replaced with a more measured approach. He was no longer the officer who took out his frustrations on civilians or belittled those he perceived as weaker. Instead, he worked harder to build relationships, to lead by example, and to treat everyone with the respect they deserved. Captain Carter continued to lead with grace, demonstrating that true power came not from exerting dominance, but from commanding respect through actions and integrity. And for Jake, it was a lesson he would never forget, one that would shape his career moving forward.